Malik Adson had always believed that water held more than life. It held stories, secrets, and the quiet power to transform a place. As a licensed water rights engineer, he had spent years studying rivers, lakes, and aquifers, but never had he owned a body of water himself. Every project had been someone else's dream. Every restored wetland or irrigation channel belonged to another, until now. One crisp autumn morning, Malik drove down a winding dirt road. A map of forgotten parcels spread on the passenger seat. He had heard rumors of an abandoned lake tucked away in a remote valley, untouched for decades. The locals called it Silvermere, though no silver had glimmered in its waters for years. When he arrived, the sight both thrilled and saddened him. Tall weeds strangled the shoreline, fallen trees littered the banks, and the water, stagnant and murky, reflected a ghost of its former self. Ducks and frogs had long vanished. Only the occasional crow dared perch on the bare branches, but Malik saw potential where others saw ruin. The lake was not just a puddle of neglect, it was a living ecosystem waiting for someone willing to listen. He stepped out of his truck, the autumn air sharp in his lungs, and ran a hand over the rough bark of a nearby willow. "I'll bring you back," he whispered almost instinctively. And in that moment, a bond was forged, a promise between man and water. The first weeks were brutal. Malik began by clearing debris, branches, rusted metal, and trash that had accumulated over decades. Each log he dragged from the water felt like lifting the weight of the lake's forgotten history. He tested water samples daily, adjusting pH levels, reintroducing oxygenation with small aeration pumps he had designed himself. Slowly, painstakingly, the murky brown waters began to clear. He planted native reeds along the banks, scattered wildflowers, and created habitats for fish and amphibians. By the end of the first month, small victories emerged. A family of mallards returned, cautiously paddling along the new shallows. Tiny minnows darted through the clearer waters. The air carried a new richness, filled with scents of wet earth, blooming flora, and the faint tang of life returning. Malik would sit on the banks at dusk, watching the sun's golden rays glint off the water, feeling a satisfaction that no engineering project or report had ever given him. This lake was his creation, but more importantly, it was his sanctuary. Yet, beneath the calm, there was an unspoken tension. Malik knew that in owning such a pristine, restored piece of nature, he might attract more than admiration. There were rules, laws, and interests he had navigated professionally for years, but private ownership of a water body, even a small lake, could attract scrutiny. It was a thought he shoved aside, preferring instead to immerse himself in the rhythm of restoration, checking pumps at dawn, inspecting water clarity, planting new reeds, and documenting each stage meticulously. Even as the weeks rolled into months, the lake transformed beyond recognition. Where once the mud and debris dominated, now lilies floated peacefully, their white blossoms mirroring the sky. Dragonflies skimmed the water, weaving patterns in the early morning mist. The surrounding trees, pruned and cleared, allowed sunlight to penetrate, warming the surface and encouraging life. Malik had built more than a lake. He had built a testament to patience, expertise, and vision. For the first time in his life, Malik felt the rare satisfaction of complete ownership, not just legally, but emotionally. Silvermere was no longer forgotten. It belonged to him, and it belonged to the creatures he had coaxed back to life. Walking along the banks one evening, he knelt and touched the cool water. "We're home," he whispered. And for the first time in decades, the lake seemed to hum back in quiet agreement, as if acknowledging the hands that had saved it. Little did Malik know that peace was fragile. A shadow was already gathering at the edges of this sanctuary, a presence that would challenge every ounce of his knowledge, patience, and resolve. The legal, the psychological, and the personal trials that lay ahead would make the months of restoration seem almost trivial. But for now, the sun was setting over Silvermere, painting gold across the surface, and Malik allowed himself a moment to simply breathe and believe that the lake was truly his. It was a crisp morning when Malik noticed an unfamiliar vehicle parked at the edge of the property. A sleek SUV, too polished for the dusty rural lane, gleamed under the sunlight. As he approached, a woman stepped out, sharply dressed, carrying a thick binder stamped with the letters HOA Authority. Her presence immediately felt out of place against the quiet, natural serenity of Silvermere. "Good morning," she said briskly, her voice carrying an air of authority that demanded attention. "I'm from the Homeowners Association. You don't have legal rights to this lake." Malik paused, confused. He had purchased the property legally, transferred the deed, and invested months restoring it. "I beg your pardon?" he asked, trying to mask the rising irritation. "This property falls under HOA jurisdiction," she replied, flipping open the binder with a practiced flourish. "You've been violating conservation easements, unauthorized development, encroachment on protected wetlands." She pointed at a page filled with official-looking stamps, signatures, and dates that seemed convincing at first glance. Malik's heart sank for only a moment before his training took over. As a water rights engineer, he had seen countless documents, permits, and legal forms. Something about these didn't add up. The dates were inconsistent. Some signatures looked like forgery, and several referenced regulations that hadn't existed in this county for over a decade. "Excuse me," Malik said carefully, taking the binder from her hands. "These documents, they don't match any official records I've seen, and according to the county registry, I am the lawful owner." The woman's eyes flickered, but she maintained a calm, almost predatory smile. "You may think that, but this is legally binding. You'll need to comply with our orders immediately." Malik's mind raced. He had prepared for legal battles over water rights before, but this was different. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to fabricate authority. A fake HOA, forged documents, and now an attempt to intimidate him into surrendering Silvermere. Over the next few days, letters began arriving in his mailbox. Notices of violation, unauthorized development, and environmental hazard piled up. Inspectors he had never requested appeared on his property, clipboard in hand, claiming authority to assess the site. At first, he tried to engage with them politely, explaining the restoration work he had carried out. They refused to acknowledge his explanations, insisting that they were acting under HOA directives. Malik also noticed subtle signs that this was more than just legal posturing. A neighbor who had once greeted him warmly now avoided eye contact, dropping cryptic remarks about following the rules and not getting involved. Another whispered that the HOA always gets what it wants, as though the lake was already being taken from him. It was unnerving, the way fear could spread silently in a community. Malik felt the first true cracks in his sense of security. The lake he had nurtured with his own hands suddenly seemed vulnerable, not to nature, but to human deceit. One evening, as he walked along the banks, he noticed fresh tire tracks leading to a pump station he had installed. The soil was disturbed, the wires slightly pulled. His initial anger quickly turned into a calculated concern. Whoever had done this had knowledge of his property layout. They weren't casual trespassers. They were probing, testing, intimidating. Malik realized this was no longer a simple legal dispute. It was psychological warfare. The fake HOA was trying to make him question his rights, his neighbors, and even the legitimacy of his own restoration efforts. Every letter, every visit, every suspicious glance from a neighbor was a tactic designed to destabilize him, to make him doubt his claim. But Malik was not one to surrender easily. Months of engineering projects, restoring waterways, and navigating complex legal frameworks had taught him discipline, patience, and strategic thinking. He resolved to fight back, not impulsively but methodically. If they wanted to play a game of intimidation, he would respond with documentation, evidence, and reason. The next morning, Malik sat at his desk with the binder spread before him. He began cataloging discrepancies, cross-referencing signatures, checking historical records. Each inconsistency was a thread, and he intended to unravel the entire fabric of deception. He knew one thing with absolute clarity. This lake, this sanctuary he had restored, belonged to him. And no forged document, no HOA scam would take it away without a fight. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting gold and orange over the still waters of Silvermere, Malik made a silent promise. They might try to scare him. They might try to overwhelm him with false authority. But he would meet every attempt with knowledge, evidence, and resolve. Silvermere had survived neglect. It would survive deceit as well. And somewhere deep in the water, beneath the reeds and returning wildlife, the lake seemed to shimmer in agreement, as if acknowledging that its protector had arrived and that the real battle was only just beginning. By the third week after the first confrontation, Malik could feel a constant weight pressing down on him. Letters arrived daily, sometimes multiple times a day, each one more absurd and threatening than the last. Violation of wetland protection ordinances, unauthorized vegetation growth, noise complaints concerning wildlife activity, all meticulously typed on HOA letterhead, complete with faux seals and signatures. Malik flipped through them repeatedly, anger bubbling under his calm exterior. The language was designed to intimidate, to make him doubt himself. The first inspection was subtle. Two men in plain clothes showed up unannounced, clipboards in hand, insisting they were acting under HOA authority. Malik politely asked for identification and proof of legal standing. They brushed him off, insisting they had the right to be there. The tension escalated when one of them stepped too close to the newly installed aeration pump, allegedly to assess water quality. Malik's instinct screamed sabotage. He followed them closely, noticing that the wires had been slightly tampered with, but the damage was minimal, enough to send a warning. That night, Malik installed temporary security cameras around the lake. By morning, he discovered that one of them had been disabled, the wiring cut in a way that indicated prior knowledge of its location. Someone had been on his property after dark, someone who knew his routines and the layout of Silvermere intimately. Then came the neighbors. People who had once smiled or waved at him now offered veiled threats or cold stares. "You know, some things are better left alone," one murmured as Malik trimmed the new reeds along the shore. Another whispered about the HOA's long reach and the inevitability of compliance. Even those who had admired his restoration began to hesitate, afraid to take sides. The isolation was subtle but effective. The psychological impact was compounded by acts of petty sabotage. A section of fencing was cut, tools went missing, and one morning, Malik discovered that some of the recently planted reeds had been uprooted. Nothing was catastrophic, but the message was clear. Someone wanted him unsettled, off balance, and questioning his right to be there. Malik noticed a pattern. Every visit by the HOA or its agents coincided with moments when he was alone, working in the quiet of dawn or dusk. They wanted him stressed, distracted, and fatigued. He realized the battle was not only about legal claims, it was about dominance. The HOA wasn't merely trying to seize the lake. They wanted to make him doubt his competence, question his ownership, and perhaps even abandon the project altogether. Despite the mounting pressure, Malik remained methodical. He meticulously documented every encounter, photographed damaged equipment, recorded suspicious tire tracks, and even traced the origins of letters. He knew that in any future legal battle, evidence would be key. But the strategy went beyond legal preparation. He had to anticipate their moves, understand their methods, and counteract psychological manipulation. One evening, as Malik walked the shoreline, he found fresh footprints around the new fish hatchery he had built. The tracks led directly to a patch of reeds where he had planted aquatic plants only days before. Someone had deliberately disturbed the area, leaving no doubt that the sabotage was intentional. The realization hit him hard. This was not random intimidation. It was orchestrated, precise, and relentless. Malik decided to set a trap. He marked the disturbed plants with discrete colored tags, installed motion sensors, and left his observation equipment running overnight. When the culprits returned under the cover of darkness, the sensors triggered, recording everything. For the first time, Malik had concrete evidence of illegal trespass. But more importantly, he had proof that the HOA's intimidation campaign extended far beyond mere paperwork. The psychological war intensified. Each letter, each inspection, each small act of vandalism tested Malik's patience. Yet with every attack, he grew more disciplined, more analytical. He learned to separate the emotional response from strategic action. Anger, fear, and frustration became tools to sharpen his focus rather than reasons to act impulsively. In a particularly brazen incident, a group claiming to be environmental inspectors arrived just as Malik was releasing a batch of trout into the lake. They claimed the species was unauthorized and demanded he stop immediately. Malik calmly explained that the species were native, previously documented in Silvermere, and part of a careful restoration plan. Frustrated, the group left, but not before one man attempted to tamper with the nets holding the fish. Malik noticed it immediately and recorded the attempt. By the end of the month, Malik had built a detailed record, dozens of letters, multiple acts of sabotage, surveillance footage, and witness accounts from neighboring properties. The fake HOA's campaign had escalated, but instead of crushing him, it had honed his focus. He understood the rules of this twisted game. Intimidation was their weapon, deception their tool. But methodical documentation and vigilance could neutralize both. Late one night, Malik stood on the dock, staring at the reflection of the moon on Silvermere's waters. The lake had survived neglect, pollution, and years of abandonment. It had been restored through hard work, patience, and knowledge. And now, it would survive deceit, fraud, and intimidation too. Malik clenched his fists, not in anger but in resolve. The HOA had begun a war, but it was one he was determined to win. Every act of sabotage, every threatening letter, every manipulated neighbor would be countered, not with rashness, but with strategy, evidence, and the unwavering belief that the lake was his to protect. And beneath the still surface, the water reflected the determination of its guardian. The battle had escalated, yes, but Malik Adson was ready. Malik sat at his desk one rainy afternoon, a stack of HOA letters spread before him like battle plans. The intimidation, the false inspections, the tampering, they had not broken him. Instead, they had sharpened his focus. Every shred of evidence, every forged signature, every suspicious visit had become part of a meticulous map, one that he intended to follow to its source. He began with the documents. Each notice, each violation report, was scrutinized with the precision of a forensic engineer. Dates were cross-checked against county records. Signatures were compared to known authentic samples. References to conservation regulations were verified against the state's legal archives. Slowly, a pattern emerged. The documents were expertly crafted but fundamentally flawed. Some stamps were outdated. Certain clauses cited laws that had never existed in Silvermere's jurisdiction. It was a sophisticated forgery, but no forgery was perfect. Malik didn't stop at paper. He returned to the property with a systematic plan. Security cameras, motion sensors, and infrared equipment were installed at strategic points around the lake. He discreetly reinforced entry points, secured the pump systems, and tagged newly planted reeds and saplings. He began recording the water levels, wildlife activity, and all disturbances meticulously. Each movement of the supposed HOA agents became a puzzle piece, helping him understand the lengths to which they were willing to go. One evening, while reviewing surveillance footage, Malik spotted a man attempting to disable one of the aeration pumps. The footage captured the man pausing to glance around nervously, then adjusting the wiring. Malik saved the clip and enhanced it, clearly showing the individual's features and attire. The pattern was undeniable. These acts were coordinated, aimed at disrupting both the ecosystem and Malik's confidence. Malik also reached out to his professional network. Former colleagues in environmental law, local government officials, and conservation authorities were consulted. He presented his findings, carefully documenting each conversation and advice received. Officials confirmed that no legitimate conservation easements existed on Silvermere, and that the HOA's claims were fraudulent. Armed with this confirmation, Malik realized he had more than just suspicion. He had proof, but proof alone was not enough. The HOA thrived on uncertainty, intimidation, and psychological manipulation. Malik needed to turn the tables to take the offensive without losing his composure. He began drafting detailed response letters to every HOA notice, citing actual laws, providing photographic evidence of restoration work, and referencing official records. Every time they tried to intimidate him, he countered with reason, documentation, and strategy. In a particularly bold move, Malik simulated vulnerabilities. He left a section of reeds slightly accessible and monitored the area overnight with high-definition cameras. Within hours, trespassers returned, confident they could undermine his work. Malik captured every action on video, cutting plants, attempting to disable equipment, and taking unauthorized photographs of the property. This time, he had irrefutable evidence. Neighbors, too, became unwitting participants in his strategy. Malik discreetly documented their conversations and observed their movements, noting anyone who acted under HOA influence. Surprisingly, some of the neighbors who had been cold or distant began to tip subtly in his favor, providing testimony and accounts of suspicious activity. The fake HOA's influence was strong, but it was beginning to fracture under the weight of Malik's methodical approach. Psychological warfare required patience and timing. Malik understood that responding emotionally would be a trap. He maintained a calm demeanor, always polite with inspectors and confrontational only when evidence supported it. When confronted on the weeks of meticulous observation, documentation, and strategy had brought Malik to a turning point. The fake HOA, which had once seemed unstoppable, was beginning to show cracks. It started with minor errors in their correspondence. A letter meant for the county records department was accidentally sent to a neighboring homeowner. Another document contained a misspelled official's name and an outdated date stamp. These errors, small though they were, provided Malik the first clear evidence that the HOA's operations were far from legitimate. Malik's surveillance footage further revealed inconsistencies. One inspector he had previously caught on camera entered the property on 3 separate occasions, each time claiming authority under different conflicting rules. In another video, 2 agents appeared together, each referring to different regulations for the same violation, contradicting each other directly. These contradictions were gold. They indicated confusion, lack of coordination, and a vulnerability Malik could exploit. He began to analyze the psychology behind the HOA's campaign. The intimidation, the sabotage, the constant letters, they were designed to make him doubt himself, to isolate him, and to make him anxious enough to make mistakes. But Malik had anticipated this. Every time he felt pressure, he reminded himself of the evidence, the records, and the knowledge he had accumulated. By staying methodical and calm, he allowed the HOA's own mistakes to surface naturally. Neighbors, too, began to shift in subtle ways. Some who had initially whispered warnings now shared what they had observed. Unfamiliar vehicles parked at odd hours, strange figures tampering with gates, or unusual activity around the lake. These accounts, once dismissed by Malik as minor observations, now became corroborating evidence of the HOA's fraudulent operations. Their support, quiet but growing, further strengthened Malik's position. One afternoon, Malik received a curious message, an anonymous tip, claiming insider knowledge of the HOA's internal operations. According to the message, there were divisions within the HOA itself. Some members doubted the legality of the claims, while others pushed forward aggressively, fearing exposure. This confirmed Malik's growing suspicion. The HOA's campaign was not unified. Their strategy depended on confidence and intimidation, but internal dissent made them vulnerable. Malik decided it was time to escalate his own campaign, not with aggression, but with controlled exposure. He began compiling a detailed timeline of the HOA's fraudulent actions, juxtaposing them with county records, expert opinions, and surveillance evidence. Each forged signature, each contradicting inspection, each act of trespass was mapped, creating a visual representation of deception. The HOA's first misstep came when they attempted another surprise inspection. Malik, now fully prepared, confronted the agents with copies of the official county records, the inspection history, and video evidence of previous trespasses. The inspectors faltered, realizing that Malik had anticipated their tactics. For the first time, they appeared uncertain, caught in a web of their own fabrication. Word of the HOA's inconsistencies began to leak. Local residents, previously intimidated, started questioning the legitimacy of the organization. Some former allies of the HOA, sensing the growing risk of exposure, began to distance themselves. Malik noted the subtle shifts. Phone calls went unanswered, scheduled meetings were canceled, and the once aggressive letters slowed. The psychological battle had flipped. Where once Malik had been reacting defensively, he now acted offensively. Each counteraction, each presentation of evidence, and each challenge to the HOA's authority chipped away at their credibility. The same intimidation tactics that had once unsettled him now backfired against them. The false authority, once imposing, was beginning to unravel in the face of meticulous documentation and reasoned challenge. Malik also began using public visibility to his advantage. He shared certain non-sensitive parts of the evidence with trusted media contacts, highlighting the absurdity and danger of the HOA's claims without revealing private property details. The subtle public exposure made the HOA cautious, forcing them into defensive positions and heightening internal tensions. One evening, Malik reviewed months of collected data and realized something remarkable. The HOA's own internal contradictions, combined with his evidence, could form a complete dismantling of their claim. Not only was their authority false, but their tactics, intimidation, sabotage, and deception were now documented comprehensively. Malik was no longer defending his lake. He was strategically setting up a case that would end the HOA's campaign entirely. The turning point came during a confrontation with the HOA's lead agent. Malik calmly laid out the timeline of infractions, juxtaposed with official records and surveillance evidence. Each false claim, each tampered inspection, each contradictory order was presented systematically. The agent, visibly flustered, could not counter the documentation. Confidence faltered, and for the first time, Malik saw hesitation where there had previously been arrogance. For the first time in months, Malik allowed himself a small smile. The psychological battlefield had shifted. The HOA, which had sought to intimidate, manipulate, and undermine him, was now exposed, faltering under the weight of its own deceit. The lake he had nurtured, the sanctuary he had restored, was no longer merely defended by his presence. It was safeguarded by a combination of strategy, evidence, and patience. As dusk fell over Silvermere, the lake shimmered with the reflection of the setting sun. Malik stood at the edge of the dock, surveying the waters that had once been abandoned and now teemed with life. He understood that the war was far from over. Legal proceedings and final confrontations still lay ahead, but for the first time, he felt in control. The HOA's weakness had been revealed, and the psychological advantage had shifted firmly into his hands. For Malik, the battle was no longer about fear or uncertainty. It was about clarity, justice, and the meticulous use of knowledge against deception. The lake, once threatened, now seemed to echo that sense of empowerment. Every ripple in the water reflected not just the physical restoration he had achieved, but the strategic victory of understanding and foresight over manipulation and intimidation. And deep inside, Malik knew one truth with certainty: Silvermere would survive this assault. The fake HOA had underestimated him, and in doing so had exposed themselves. Malik's preparation, patience, and unshakable resolve had turned the tide. The lake, which had once been threatened by deceit, now stood protected, not just by law, but by the intelligence, determination, and strategy of its rightful guardian. The morning of the hearing arrived with a tense stillness. Malik had spent months preparing for this moment, gathering evidence, corroborating witness statements, and meticulously documenting every act of deception, sabotage, and intimidation by the fake HOA. Now, he would take the battle from the lake's banks to the courtroom, where the law itself would arbitrate the fate of Silvermere. The courthouse was imposing, with tall windows that let in streams of sunlight, highlighting the dust motes floating in the air. Malik entered, carrying a thick folder containing every piece of evidence he had assembled: photographs, videos, letters, official records, and notes from conversations with neighbors and authorities. He felt a steadying calm as he approached the bench, fully aware that preparation and knowledge were his greatest weapons. Opposite him sat the HOA representatives, smug and confident, dressed in crisp suits and holding their own stack of forged documents. They projected an air of authority that the untrained eye might believe, but Malik had seen through the facade long ago. Every claim they made, every signature they presented, was already undermined by the evidence he had painstakingly collected. The judge entered, and the courtroom fell silent. Malik presented himself clearly, stating his case succinctly. He was the lawful owner of Silvermere. The lake had been restored under his supervision, and the HOA's claims were based entirely on forged conservation documents and fabricated authority. First, Malik laid out the timeline of events. Letters, inspections, and acts of sabotage were presented chronologically, each annotated with dates, witness accounts, and photographic evidence. Surveillance footage was shown, capturing trespassers attempting to disable equipment, disturb vegetation, and intimidate Malik on his property. The courtroom watched in silent fascination as videos played, showing individuals in the act of illegal interference. Next came the documentary evidence. Forged documents were juxtaposed with official county records, highlighting discrepancies in dates, signatures, and references to non-existent regulations. Experts Malik had consulted testified, confirming the forgeries and clarifying the true legal status of the property. The HOA's credibility began to crumble as contradictions in their paperwork and testimonies became increasingly apparent. Witness statements from neighbors further bolstered Malik's case. Those who had once feared retribution came forward, recounting suspicious activity and intimidation tactics. They described seeing individuals tampering with property, observing the lake without permission, and spreading misinformation about Malik's ownership. Each account added weight to the narrative of deception and harassment perpetrated by the HOA. The fake HOA representatives attempted to interject, presenting their fabricated conservation easements and claiming authority. Malik responded calmly,